The British Churchill tank is a unique vehicle, and though it was created from an obsolete design philosophy, it had its strengths, and it was one of the most heavily armoured tanks of World War II. So today we will look into the history and development of these heavy tanks. Contrary to the popular belief, the Churchill tanks were not named after Winston Churchill, but his ancestor John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. The history of these tanks started before World War II, when to an infantry support tank specification, the A20 design was proposed. At that time, the British tank doctrine aimed to use two different types of tanks. The fast and light cruiser tanks, usually equipped with high-velocity guns to attack enemy armor, and slower, heavily armored infantry support tanks to give fire support to the advancing infantry. The A20 was meant to be used alongside the Matilda and Valentine tanks, and this design still showed the experiences from the First World War. It was a long, narrow design on purpose, to be able to cross trenches and bomb craters, and carry heavy armor to withstand the usual anti-tank weapons of the time. The original design of the A20 was envisioned having two Panzer guns in spawn zones on each side, but soon this was changed and the next variant mounted a turret similar to the Matilda tank. By June 1940, the first prototypes were ready, but during the building it was realized that two Panzer gun is not suited for infantry support at all, so a second gun, a 3-inch howitzer, was added in the hull. But by that time, the Battle of France was over, and the tank designers had to realize that this war will not be like the First World War at all. The trenches and slow lumbering trench crossing tanks were the past. The quicker, well-coordinated tanks, used together with artillery and air support, were the future. This meant a change in plans, but the British still wanted a new heavy tank. The A20 design was very underpowered, and Vauxhall received the task to come up with a more powerful engine. To save on cost and development time, they chose to combine two 6-cylinder engines together, creating a 12-cylinder, or rather twin-6 engine, developing 350 horsepower. Based on the experiences in the Battle of France, the design of the tank was revised as well, to better suit this new type of warfare. The new design kept the overall shape and the heavy armor, which was 89mm thick on the front. It used bolted armor plates, which was only changed to welded construction on later models. The suspension was not a modern design either, but to give the tank low ground pressure, it used lots of small road wheels to distribute the weight on the tracks. The new A22 design specification was given to Vauxhall, and two prototypes were ordered. The War Office also stated that the new tanks had to be in production in a year. This rush was understandable, as the British lost a huge amount of equipment in France, and only around 100 tanks left to defend Britain in case of a German invasion. The deadline was tight, but the first prototypes were finished in December 1940, and the first Mark I models rolled out the assembly line in June 1941. But the hasty development, of course, left little time to test the new tanks and work out the faults, so the first few series of Churchills were plagued with problems. Initially the tracks only lasted for about 20 miles, but this was not a big problem, as the engine and the running gear usually broke down more often. The clutch and transmission were also too weak. One tank had several transmission replacements during trials, in a span of a week. Some people even voiced opinions that the development should be scrapped, but this was not a real option, as the A22 was the only newly developed tank that was somewhat close to production. The British needed tanks and needed something better than the old designs which failed in France. Over time the faults were slowly fixed, and by the end of 1941 most of them were solved. The production variants during 1941 were still built with the 2-pounder gun in the turret and the 3-inch howitzer in the hull, but this was changed not long after. To see the changes during production, now let's take a look at the Churchill variants. The first production variant was the Churchill 1. These variants were very unreliable because of the rush to put them into production. They featured the 2-pounder gun in the turret and the 3-inch howitzer in the hull. They can be easily identified by the entirely unprotected tracks, the small rounded turret housing the 2-pounder gun, and the howitzer in the hull. 303 were built. The next in line was the Churchill Mark II. Because the 3-inch howitzer in the hull was nearly useless, it was dropped and replaced by a Bisa machine gun. They were similar to the Mark Is, but missing the howitzer in the hull. 1,127 were built. A very limited variant was the Mark II CS, close support variant. In this variant, the 2-pounder gun and the howitzer swapped places, mounting the howitzer in the turret and the anti-tank gun in the hull. Only a few were built and they didn't see combat. The Churchill Mark III was the first big rework of the tank, featuring a bigger welded turret housing the more powerful 6-pounder gun and redesigned track covers. 675 units were produced. Identifying feature is the welded turret, which is sloped on the top, the 6-pounder gun, and the new side skirt with the catwalk on it. The early Mark III models used the under intakes on the sides, where the intake was on the bottom. Later models were upgraded, and the new intake had the openings on the top. Since the armor plates to build the new turret had limited availability, the next Churchill Mark IV variant again used a cast turret, but otherwise it was similar to the Mark III models. The turret loosely followed the shape of the Mark III turret, but it was more round because of the casting. 1,622 were built. The next Mark V variant was similar to the Mark IV with similar turret but mounting a 95mm howitzer. 241 were produced. The Churchill Mark VI was upgunned with the Ordnance QF 75mm gun. The original 6-pounder gun, though it had good performance against armored targets, didn't have a usable high-explosive shell. And in North Africa, where the British tanks often faced German anti-tank guns, this became a problem. The new QF 75mm gun was basically a 6-pounder, but as it turned out, the 6-pounders can be bored out to fire the 75mm American mid shells. Identifying features of the Mark VI are the collar at the turret base and the different gun shield and muzzle. From this variant, only 200 units were made. The following Mark VII variant was the biggest upgrade on the Churchill tanks. It used the new 75mm gun, but more importantly, its armor was totally upgraded and redesigned. By 1943, the vertical 89mm thick frontal armor was not as effective as it was initially. When met with the German high-velocity 88mm on 75mm guns, it proved to be too weak. So a complete up-armoring of the tank was in order. But the task wasn't easy, as the already heavy and slow tank couldn't just be up-armored, as that would have made it even heavier and slower. So the hull was changed from riveted to fully welded production, which allowed the designers to get rid of the inner frame, which saved a lot of weight. The tank also received a new turret, which was a hybrid construction. The turret was cast, but the top was welded, which made the production easier. The design actually was based on an early prototype turret built for the Cromwell tank. The front armor on the hull was increased to 152mm. This was 1.5 times more than on the German Tiger tanks. The side armor was also increased to 95mm thickness. The turret was similarly armored, with 152mm thickness on the front and 95mm on the sides. The Churchill Mark VIII was a variant of the Mark VII, mounting the 95mm howitzer instead of the 75mm cannon. The Churchill NE-75 model was the brainchild of Captain Percy Morrell. These were modified versions using American 75mm guns, salvaged from disabled Shermans, and mounted on Churchill Mark IVs. The Churchill's mantle area had to be cut out to give the gun enough elevation. But a bigger problem was that in the Sherman, the loader was positioned on the left and the gunner on the right of the gun, while in the Churchill it was the opposite. To fix this problem, the gun was turned upside down in its mounting, so the breech opened on the right, and it was modified to link the gun controls on the other side. These variants can be easily identified by the outside gun mantlet. A late war evolution of the Churchill was the A43 project, the so-called Black Prince, which was an attempt to mount the 17-pounder gun on the Churchill chassis. To fit the bigger gun in a new turret, the hull had to be redesigned as well to accommodate the bigger turret ring. The new tank, for unknown reasons, maintained the engine used in the Churchill tanks, instead of the already available Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, which was used in the Cromwell tanks and was much stronger and more reliable. By the time the prototypes were built, the war ended, and the project was terminated as the Centurion tanks that were developed in parallel were much better in every aspect. There were several specialized versions of the Churchill, but we will not look into them in detail just yet, as they can fill a separate video. There were flamethrower tanks, anti-fortification variants, bridge layers, recovery variants, flare tanks, ramp carriers, turretless personnel carriers, and so on. The Churchill Mark VII featured 152mm thick armor on the half front and 95mm on the side. The turret was similarly armored with 152mm thickness on the front and 95mm on the sides. Because of the heavy armor, the tank weighted 41 tons. It used a 12-cylinder petrol engine developing 350 horsepower. Its maximum speed was only 15 miles an hour with a range of 56 miles. The tank's main armament was a QF 75mm gun, and the secondary armament consisted of 2 Besa machine guns. The Churchill tanks first saw combat during the infamous Dieppe raid in August 1942, where nearly 60 of them participated. This included Mark I's, Mark II flamethrower tanks, and Mark III's with 6-pounder guns. They were meant to land together with engineering troops, who would clear the tank traps, while the tanks would cover the infantry. But the plan fell apart even before landing, as the raiding fleet mixed up and arrived late and scattered. The infantry arrived at dawn instead of under the cover of the night. The engineers arrived before the tanks, which were also late. Though the German propaganda films showed the destroyed Churchills on the shore, it's a common misconception that they all bogged down there. Some of them had their tracks clogged with rocks and stayed on the beach, but about half of the tanks made it into the town, but being unable to deal with concrete barriers and tank traps, they couldn't advance further. In the end, the tanks returned to the beach to cover the infantry and evacuate, but the landing ships couldn't approach because of the German shore batteries, so most Churchills fought on as long as they could. Their armor proved to be reliable against the German 37 and 50mm anti-tank guns, but their tracks and suspension was still vulnerable. This raid didn't have the already bad reputation of the Churchill, so the British were more cautious when deploying them the next time, which was in October 1942, when 6 Mark III and 2 Mark II Churchills were sent to North Africa. The Mark II's guns were found too weak, as the 2-pounder gun at that time struggled against the newer, up-armored Panzer III variants. But the 6-pounder on the Mark III's fared much better. The Churchill Brigade, unofficially called King Force because it was commanded by Major Norris King, supported the 7th Motor Brigade in the Second Battle of El Alamein. Some of the Churchills received more than 80 hits from different caliber guns, even from 6-pounder British anti-tank ones when they were mistaken for German tanks. But only one of them was lost when a shell set the engine compartment on fire. The Churchills proved to be well protected, but not invincible of course, and they still had reliability issues. But the combat reports provided valuable information. As a result, the decision was made to send more of them to North Africa, and they participated in the Tunisian campaign in early 1943. In April, it was a Churchill tank 6-pounder shell which jammed the turret ring on the famous Tiger 131, which was abandoned by its crew and became the first Tiger to be captured by the Allies. And today it's in working condition and on display at the Bovington Tank Museum. Now the Churchills proved their worth in fighting. Their off-road capabilities and thick armor were used confidently, and by 1943 their mechanical issues were mostly fixed. So they were again used in Italy, including the modified NA-75 versions. The Montgomery initially preferred the Shermans, so the Churchills arrived in Italy later, but eventually in the difficult terrain, the Churchill again proved to be a valuable asset, supporting the infantry. They had a great role breaking through the heavy defenses of the so-called Hitler Line and Gothic Line. During and after the Normandy landings, the Churchills were used alongside the Shermans, and their specialized versions were a big asset breaking through the German defenses. The AVRE version's heavy mortars were used against fortifications, and sometimes it was enough for the Churchill Crocodile to show up to force the German defenders to surrender. The Churchill tanks were often used against fortified positions, and many times proved to be able to cross terrain that no other vehicle was able to. 300 Churchills were sent to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and they participated in the Battle of Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk. The Churchill tanks were used until the end of World War II, and some of them even participated later in the Korean War, but they were retired from service not long after, in 1952. Though they were not a modern design and initially were plagued with problems, the Churchill tanks proved their worth in the war, with their exceptional armor and great off-road capabilities. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.